all the stuff we said in 2020, forget that.
Put it on pause.
Put that
We'll
on
pick it back
pause.
up when we've got money.
Yeah. Black Lives Matter some of the time.
Yeah.
Welcome to Impolite Company, where we talk about all the topics that interest us and that impact our lives as queer Black people in the workplace. I'm Ella, and I work with companies on transforming their leadership cultures.
And I'm Kieran, and I'm a leader in design and research in the tech space.
Hi. Hey. So Kieran and I are already just talking about how not nervous. I wouldn't describe us both as nervous, but how even in coming to this podcast and wanting to just have a fairly free-flowing, fairly unfiltered conversation, we're both putting pressure on ourselves to have the perfect answer, know the perfect discussion topics, and be perfect in every way.
And effectively making it feel really unnatural.
Yes. Yeah, doing the opposite of what we're trying to achieve here. But I think it's an interesting question as we embark upon our first podcast recording, the first pancake, as we're calling this first episode, what it feels like to be, or the pressure, I suppose, that we put on ourselves, essentially as minorities, in professional spaces, of which this is sort of a professional space.
Yeah.
To get it right and to be hyper prepared and to know all of the answers just in case, and to be the expert.
Yeah, and we just basically just questioned each other on that and been like, when we speak to each other, do we care about having all the right answers? I'm like, no, because nobody's perfect.
No, and we want this to feel, I think, very much like a dinner party conversation. Almost.
Yeah.
The kinds of conversations that we have over dinner all of the time.
I love that dinner party. I'm like, in my head, I go to like a really elegant like dinner party where we're talking
Very
about
refined affair. In a very classy setting. But we're both, I think it feels I'd be fair to say it feels unnatural to us both to bring an unstructured conversation into what feels like a fairly professional setting, because of all of the pressure, which is part of what we're, I suppose, trying to talk about with this podcast, is the rules we set for ourselves as people who exist at multiple intersections, and the ways in which we experience pressure that other people maybe are not so aware of. Yeah,
and I think this is a really good example of us putting ourselves out there and getting an insight of like how we process this, right? Like, it's not always easy, and a lot of the time we've had to be super prepared for stuff to make sure that there's no weakness in your armor, or there's no perceived weakness in your armor.
Yes.
And being genuine and being vulnerable is something that I think you have to learn and practice. And I think this is we're doing that, right? I think we're always doing it.
We are practicing in action. But, it's an interesting point, because this, by definition, I'm in a room with my friend. There's no one else here. By definition, this is a safe space.
Yeah.
And yet it takes us quite a lot to almost like reprogram and unlearn a lot of the practices that we've picked up of needing to be perfect in every space, because we're used to being in spaces that don't feel safe. Yeah,
it's true. It's a thing that until you are able to comprehend it and talk about it and describe it like how you've just done, you then have to deal with it. And you have to be super aware of it and make sure that you're not being your own worst enemy. And that imposter syndrome that we spoke about earlier, that's that voice going, like, who cares? Like, who cares about what you have to say? Are you good enough? Is this a conversation that other people are having? Or, like, what's the value? It's like, no, actually, go away voice. Go away imposter syndrome voice. And that's what I was saying earlier as well. It's like, I definitely have this internal conversation with myself. It's like, I know who you are, I'm aware of you, and I'm actually going to decide not to listen to you today.
Yes, your saboteur.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. And if it doesn't go great, and it doesn't go how I expect it to go, guess what? I'm going to learn from it. So I win. It's a win-win.
Yes. Do you know what this is making me think of? I'm absolutely segueing into an off-topic conversation already.
Yeah, let's do it.
But it makes me think of, there's a programme on, I think it's on Sky Atlantic, about Julia Child, with Sarah Lancashire in it. Sarah Lancashire is a ultimate babe. And it's great. It's just very feel-good, lovely, comforting period drama, comedy thing. And it's about how she became a TV chef. And there's this, basically she pushes and pushes to get on TV, and she really puts herself out there and tries to get this pilot, and nobody wants it, and all of this stuff. And she does this absolutely disastrous first recording.
Yeah.
And she ends up getting, various things happen. She ends up getting a show. Yeah. But I watched it, and I was just so in awe of how willing she was to be bad. How willing she was to go, nobody's ever done a cooking show before, really. This was pre what we're used to seeing on TV. And she was a chef, but she was trying to make dishes, coq au vin. Takes 3 hours, and she's trying to do that on telly in 28 minutes. Kind of scripted, moving around a set. All of the things that we're used to now, but hadn't been worked out at that point in time. And it's messy, and the knives are blunt, and she's got to rip the chicken apart, and she doesn't know what her cues are, and it's just chaos.
Yeah.
But it's like the making of her becoming a household name because she's brave, basically. And so, anyway, that was a huge segue.
You're just preparing our listeners. Hopefully someone's listening somewhere. Maybe mum's listening.
Maybe mum's listening. For that kind of bravery.
Yeah. And that's a thing, right? Like and when you're in environments that don't necessarily naturally reward people for making mistakes or doing things differently, that's also could be considered a mistake if you do something differently.
Yes. Personal risk.
Yeah, it becomes a very risky business.
Yes.
And you have to, and you can find yourself trying to measure that risk. It's like, if I do this, what is it gonna? It's the right thing to do. I know it is, and I think I've got much better at it the more experience I have and the more senior I am. Because I guess you have a little bit more privilege the more senior you get.
Yeah.
You have a little bit more. You have a little bit more. You have the ability to make mistakes essentially, and be able to explain why you did it, and people will listen.
Yes.
I think when you're more junior, or you're at the beginning of your career, or maybe your career switching, it's a lot harder to do that, and it's a lot harder to be like, look at me, I'm just making mistakes. But I'm learning. People are like, we just want someone that doesn't make mistakes.
Yeah.
And it's
You need to stop making mistakes is the kind of message when you're junior, for sure. Yeah, I always that freedom that you get with seniority and the ability to take risks. I mean, this actually does my segue, though incredibly off-piste, has led us sort of to talking about what we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
On the topic of risk.
Yes.
And seniority and freedom to make mistakes and all of those things. I guess the main thing we're going to talk about today, although we will see where the conversation leads us, are all of these layoffs, all of these redundancies in the tech, or in the big tech space, for sure. So to put that in perspective, I think I read that these are the biggest layoffs since 2001, since that kind of big major tech bubble burst, the dot-com bubble burst 20 or so years ago. And what we're seeing is between 10 and 20% of workers being laid off at some of these big tech companies. Stripe, Meta, Amazon is laid off, I think, about 10,000 workers.
Yeah.
So
we're seeing worldwide more than 120,000 tech workers losing their jobs as a result of the cutbacks by US tech companies, and that's having an effect. Most US tech companies are global, right? So that's having an effect on all of the countries that they operate in, and I guess all of their suppliers as well. It will have a collateral effect on 120,000 tech workers.
Yeah, that's enormous.
It's huge.
I don't know how many people work in tech in general, but that feels like a pretty significant number. And then the question is how, or the kind of key question we're going to talk about is what impact this has beyond the obvious general human impact that any layoffs have on diversity, equity and inclusion strategy, on diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives, programs, teams, and what that means, what this potentially means for the future of this space.
Yeah. And what impact is that going to have on, we've spent the last, ever since I've worked in tech, we've talked about culture. We've been investing in culture.
Ping pong tables.
Ping pong tables, yeah.
Yoga.
Ping pong tables, yoga, all the things that create culture, apparently. But we've just had such a massive emphasis on culture is king. You have to have culture or you can't deliver. And there's been a lot of things that are done in a way that's very let's just do it because it looks good. Let's not actually do the groundwork and make sure that it is actually part of our culture. It's just about the image, essentially. And then you've had companies that have really invested in it. What does this mean for that? Like, who does it affect? And how important is culture now? Like, is that something that's still surviving these cuts? Or is it, when I say culture, like the teams that are really important to that?
Well, what we know is that some of the biggest cuts already happening are in the teams and the departments that are responsible for culture. I mean, I know that there's that kind of adage that everybody is responsible for culture, and that's the
easy way.
That's what maybe the CEO might tell you.
Yeah.
But people teams, HR functions, employee engagement functions, some of the functions that are not even necessarily just in the kind of HR space, but functions that are often described as not business critical, quote unquote, we already know we're seeing some of the deepest cuts in those areas. And what we also know is that in those areas you often see more minority individuals, more women, certainly. And so there's a couple of questions here. There's when you make deep cuts across any department, across all departments in your tech company, what impact does that have on culture, full stop?
Yeah.
And then there's another question of when you look at where the cuts are happening, what does that mean for the message that you send? And if the cuts are happening in areas where those people are responsible in some way for building culture, well-being, people, all of those kind of functions, and also they're the largest concentration often of people from historically marginalised backgrounds. What's the message that's being sent?
Yeah. And is there a message being sent? Like, is there an active message being sent out by these companies? Are they spending time to make sure that messaging is really clear, like around the intention? I have the feeling from what I've read is that these companies, when they want to, they'll scream and shout about a lot of these things and be like, we're making all these cuts, but we're doing our best to make sure, and this is what we're doing. We're not hearing any of that. From what I've read, we're not really seeing any of that. We're just like, these are cuts that are happening everywhere. It's like, these are just cuts, but there's no detail. There's no like, this is also the other thing that we're doing to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact on our culture and the people that are left. This is the other things that we're doing to make sure that the people that are leaving those businesses, yes, I'm sure there are great severance packages that these companies are putting together, but they're being put out into a market that essentially has no roles.
But the first answer in my mind to your question is I think a message is always being sent, whether it's explicit or not. Yeah. So, what's the narrative when a company, let's say, fires somebody who's been at the company for a long time and doesn't really say anything about it, or doesn't really treat that person well on the way out, and we all know that that's happened. Yeah. The company's not explicitly, let's say, bad-mouthing that person, but a very clear message is being sent about A, how we treat people, B, how we care about honouring the people's contributions on the way out, etc. So you're always sending some kind of message.
Yeah, I agree.
Whether you're being explicit about it or not. And it seems from a lot of what we're reading about these current waves of layouts is there's an implicit message that's being sent. Nobody's coming out the gates and saying, we don't care about DEI anymore. That was a flash in the pan. Let's just, all the stuff we said in 2020, forget that.
Put it on pause. We'll pick it back up when we've got money.
Yeah. Black Lives Matter some of the time.
Yeah.
Nobody's sending that explicit message, but that there is an implicit message here.
Yeah.
But I suppose there is a question, or there's a defense perhaps when layoffs are happening across industry that this is an unavoidable thing. Do you subscribe to this being, to some degree, what's happening across tech, and it's just that's the way it goes?
I have an opinion on that. I think you can tell by my face. I'm like, that sounds like some bullshit.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say that is because everybody, apparently, but tech companies knew that the behaviors, and maybe I'm making massive assumptions because I work in UX, but everybody knew that this was the way our changes in our behaviors were because of the pandemic, and they wouldn't necessarily continue that way as soon as we're allowed to get back out in the house, get back out of the house and be able to things start going back to normal for some reason. And I think that's because of the short-term way in which tech and business in general works. It's very reactive. They made all these big bets and investments in things that worked during the pandemic and forecast a bunch of stuff based on that. And they essentially just got carried away in a lot of cases and didn't expect for there to be this economic crisis that we're going into now, which is a recession. So I do think, I don't subscribe to the fact that it was avoidable. I know it's a lot easier to say after the fact, but I think it's some bullshit. I think people need to take accountability and say, actually, we just expanded too quickly. And I think that...
Isn't that always true of tech? We always expanded too quickly and we had to lay people off.
It's so true. We
didn't have as much runway as we thought we did.
Yeah.
So...
and part of that is the risk that you take working in a startup or a scale-up.
Yes.
I think we're talking about companies that have been around for a long time, that know better.
Yeah.
That did not really make decisions potentially with the most amount of logic. And that's why we're seeing such, they're massive layoffs. And Facebook, for example, is massively investing in the metaverse. There's thousands of employees working on it. is that the right thing for now? Who knows? Like, maybe there is some visionary thing now that most people don't understand, but
maybe it's so visionary. Maybe the metaverse is so visionary. We just can't see it yet. It's just the emperor is wearing silken robes that are just not discernible to the naked eye.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just not of the right ilk to be able to understand
we don't,
and see that far into the future. Or maybe we just can't see that far into the future because we don't have the means and the security to be able to just fall back and go, hopefully this will work.
Yeah.
And the worst case swenario, I'm still a millionaire.
But it's just also so far in the future that it like has circled back and it looks like a PlayStation 1. Like I don't know how we've gone we're so visionary, we've kind of come all the way back and it looks like Tekken.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just not. There's this weird thing going on with the metaverse that I find so fascinating. Is like, yes, we will get to what a lot of what people are speculating we'll get to in some shape or form, but we're trying to sell that on essentially what looks like, like PlayStation 1 level graphics,
tech.
Like Parappa the Rapper graphics. Like that's what we're dealing with here. We're like, this is going to be the future. And it's like, but this looks...
It's like Crash Bandicoot
like
looked
the
better
past.
when I was
when
I was 7.
Yeah, it was more immersive.
It was.
I do have an Oculus and I love it. And I think there are, if it wasn't sold to be this visionary thing, you just, the gaming element of it, which I don't think translates when you see videos of it, is a really big part of it. And in the gaming industry, it's like really known that graphics aren't everything. Mm-hmm. It's about the game design. That's what really hooks people. Graphics is a very small part. Well, it's a part of it, but it doesn't have to be everything.
Yes. Whereas I'm a non-gamer.
Yeah.
My partner's a gamer.
Yeah.
So the only games I like watching her play are like
visually.
Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Brilliant.
You know, because I'm like, well, I can sit and watch this because I'm watching a film.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm watching you play a film.
Yeah. And a lot of games are built that way, right? And they have traditional storytellers and filmmakers that are now building out these games. So like like Assassin's Creed is one of them. Uncharted Territory is another franchise that I love. It's like you're playing a film, and people can watch it, and all the cutscenes are like really well scripted, and you can tell there's work gone into it. And I think that would still. I've played some of the older ones that don't have the best graphics, and I kind of got into the franchise a little bit later, and I was still just as hooked. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the thing that there's like this big delta between what's being sold, and then it's like, and this is it, the future.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, that's not exciting to look at and I'm not seeing all the other dynamics underneath the surface.
Yes.
Like the Horizons, which is like the kind of partially user created generated worlds where you can like walk around and go into these different rooms. I was like, I just want to see what this is like. And I was like quite impressed by how like you can get quite hooked to it. So there were like a few user generated worlds that were quite interesting. There's like a courtroom one where people take like all the different positions. So you have like defendant, plaintiff, the jury, judge, and then you play out like this whole like courtroom scene plays out, but it's all unscripted and like.
So it's like almost like improv role play courtroom.
Yeah. And then like you watch it play out, and some of the ones that I was in were hilarious. Like you were completely immersed for one. Mm-hmm. You didn't even really care about people not having legs, and and it's quite funny. And actually, it brought some of the comedy because like people, if you like hold the controllers behind you, your avatar like goes up into the air, and the arms become really long, go behind, and it starts like glitching. Yeah. And it's just really funny.
Yeah.
So there's like, you can see where like it's all about the gameplay, which is really important for something like that. But like, it's not sellable.
Yes.
And you're plowing loads of money into it. It's being oversold. You're using like literally computer generated adverts that aren't real gameplay.
And is there, in the meta example, it feels a bit like you've gone to bat for this thing quite publicly.
Yeah.
and expensively, and there's a load of sunk cost now, you've now got egg on your face if you say that was an expensive experiment, that sucked. We're just gonna...
You have to commit to it, right? Like...
Yeah. And is there with the tech phenomenon that we're seeing, is there an element here of, you've got the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, the Elon Musks of the world, I mean, arguably sociopathic individuals in charge of... We're going in. We said it would be an unfiltered.
And it is.
In charge of these enormous companies that have, in some cases, tens of thousands of employees, making abstract decisions about where to invest and where to cut and how to cut.
Yeah.
Seemingly not rooted, if I take the Elon Musk example, seemingly not rooted in any kind of logic.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile? I don't think this is the case in all of these companies.
Yeah.
Stripe, Lyft, all of these companies, will have, I'm sure, competent leadership teams. Yeah. But in some cases, you do have companies that are being seemingly led with very little logic. A lot of executives being fired in the Elon Musk case. A lot of executives walking out on day one.
Yeah.
ERGs, so employee resource groups, so communities basically being decimated overnight. I think there was a Blackbirds.
Yeah. Twitter
women, all decimated overnight.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile, I suppose, the decision making that's happening in some cases with the commitments to culture that were being made 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm sure if you asked Elon that, he would say, yes, we thought about that. I mean, did you though? Like, thinking about it and taking it into consideration, two different things. Like, I feel like a lot of these decisions are made on a surface level without, in a very clinical way, without diving too deep into the collateral effect it will have and damage that it has a lot of the time. So was the Blackbirds group at Twitter disbanded because there was nobody left to run it? Because of that's just how it landed, how the axe fell? Or was it that there was a conscious decision and it was known, or maybe not all, but was it kind of known that, oh yeah, we're probably going to lose the Blackbirds group if we do this? Is that a risk we're willing to take? Yeah. Both are not right, but at least if it was unconscious, it's unconscious. If it's conscious, we've got another problem that we need to deal with. I suspect most of these things are pretty unconscious. It's done at a high level, and it's the collateral damage that's then like, oh, I didn't think about that. I know in my experience, when I've had to go through these things, I've definitely had to do a lot of upward coaching to say, that if you make that decision, like the collateral damage it could have and what the message it sends.
This will be the result.
It's like, oh yeah, would it? I'm like, yeah.
Well, yeah, I think this comes on to something that we were talking about, in advance of this, which is, Elon Musk isn't a great example here because this is the Twitter implosion.
Yeah.
Is just such a unique thing that we're watching in real time as someone takes over something and
it's got so many layers.
Eviscerates it from the, so that's its own kind of beast in a way. But I think this conversation comes on to some of the things we were speaking about in advance, which is when layoffs happen, how are the decisions made and what is the humanity of the decision making?
Yeah.
And how can a business reconcile it's cultural commitments and it's human work with sitting in a room of executives looking down a spreadsheet and saying, who are we going to cut?
Yeah.
And are those decisions ever neutral?
Yeah.
Can they ever be neutral?
Yeah. And I also think, how are those decisions impacted if you don't have a diverse workforce, especially in more senior or allies in more senior roles, making some of those more granular decisions that truly understand the impact it's going to have?
Yes.
I've definitely been in scenarios where it's like, okay, so the company needs to reduce the workforce by 30%. Who's your 30%? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think as a black gay man, I probably start thinking about, okay, what does this mean for the team? I start thinking about the cultural shift it's going to create within that team. I start thinking about, and I'm not saying this is just exclusive to black gay men thinking this way, but when you come from an underrepresented group, there's experiences that you've had and you know how these things have impacted you. How will changing that environment make someone like me or someone in my team that's from another kind of intersection feel? And how will that impact performance? Like, this is also commercial, right? And I think that sometimes there's a clinical approach to these types of things of like, everybody's the same and we just take 30% away and all those people will continue to deliver the same. It's like, no, you've taken away some of the magic taken away some of the fuel that allows them to deliver like that.
Well, there's a few elements to that as even that point, because both of us have been in situations in working within tech companies where layoffs have happened, and either we've been part of it, we've had to deliver that news in some way to our teams, or we've not been part of it, but we've observed it and lived through it and lived through the aftermath of it.
Yeah.
And what is always interesting to me is there's that aspect that you've just spoken about, which is if we cut 30% of an organization, we can't expect that the remaining people are going to be operating at the same level.
Yeah.
Humans don't work that way.
Yeah.
We can talk in very aspirational terms about how we want to make sure that everyone's working at their best at all times.
Yeah.
But in order for people to be working at their best, they need to be fulfilled and able to be creative and psychologically safe.
Yeah.
And guess what? No one's psychologically safe just after all their friends have been cut or half their team has been cut.
Yeah.
And one of the things, so there's that aspect. And then there's the other aspect, which in my experience, I don't know if you've felt this as well. I'm always surprised that people seem shocked by this, but when you make mass layoffs, another percentage of people just leave.
Yeah.
And that always seems to be surprising to people.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, we let go of, 10 people in our 30-person team and now another 5 have left.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah.
Yeah. And
of course.
Yeah. And I think people are surprised because it's also very unpredictable how that will fall. You don't know the relationships that person has formed across the business, not just within their team. It's not contained. It's not containable. And I think that's what shocks people. It's like, okay, we lost some of it. Oh, wait, hold on. Why is that other person? And then when you kind of look back at it, it's like, these are relationships that were formed because they were working on things, and it's a potentially a cross-functional relationship where people are doing different things and building these relationships, talking openly with each other about their experience and what's happening, and also people that are maybe aligned in terms of values.
Yes.
And are willing to be like, actually, no, I don't want to be here if that's how that person was treated. So guess what? I'm off. And I think that's very hard to, and then you have the observers. So you have people that are not, I think a lot of businesses think they can pull the wool over people's eyes. And what they're not realizing is sometimes in businesses, employees are ahead of the game. They can see what's happening. They can see it playing out. They're not in an echo chamber sometimes like the leadership might be. And they have a better grasp of what's going on.
You see that when when messaging gets delayed.
Yeah.
I'll never understand why messaging gets delayed. This seems to, again, be a phenomenon that happens over and over again that surprises
Can't help
people.
but feel like the way you're talking about this is like with some sarcasm. Like, it's phenomenon.
It's just
yeah, it's true though.
It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
I've lived through this so many times that not necessarily in relation to mass layoffs, but you know, let's say the company has decided to let someone go, and
sorry, we've just got a motorbike driving through the studio. Someone's trying to.
We're in London. It's gritty. It's a gritty situation. It's real life. You know, let's say an executive will be let go for whatever reason, and when an executive is let go, there's a series of things that have happened in order for that to take place. There's a series of conversations that have happened.
Yeah.
Depending on how senior they are, the board might be involved.
Yeah.
It's not a willy-nilly split-second decision.
Yeah.
And then either the messaging won't go out.
Yeah.
Or the messaging, or there'll be some scramble to get the messaging out.
Yeah.
And then the messaging will be really wishy-washy or clearly inauthentic.
Yeah. Or some parallel messaging is happening at the same time.
And that's what happens when you delay the messaging.
Yeah.
Parallel messaging starts to happen because people start to talk and say, what's happening over there?
Yeah.
Have you heard that there?
Yeah.
And this kind of gossip machine starts to fire up. And that's another thing that companies, and I suppose both of our experiences in tech, seem to get wrong time and again. So I suppose there's this question around what's the right way to handle the very human thing that we're talking about here, which is when you lay people off or you ask people to leave or you fire people. Yeah. That's a human thing that you're doing. You're impacting someone's real life. Yeah. You know, we were speaking in advance of this about some of the people who are being laid off at the moment who are Indian nationals and are losing their visa status and maybe 4 years into a 6-year visa process and loads of real knotty life consequences.
It's really complex.
And yet, how do you handle these, or how do you make these decisions without taking those things into account? Yeah.
And I would suspect you don't have the resources to think about those things at a very granular level when you're making those top level decisions. But I guess it's how you empower middle management. I guess anybody who's not in a C-suite or VP and below, I don't know, at whatever level it is for your business, how do you trust and empower them to understand what you're trying to achieve, sense check it, and lead with some of those decisions. So not only can they deliver that authentically, but they are taking into consideration some of those things. And you need to have people in that middle management, like I said earlier, that are able to think in that way and understand in a bit more depth and speculate on what the different scenarios could be and how we can support that. I think even me just saying that, I feel like a lot of people that are making those decisions at the top are like, oh, that's too details. Like, I just want something easy.
It's easy to make these decisions in more of a detached way because maybe the more you think about the human side of it, the more difficult it gets. But even when, you know, I've read a few articles that have mentioned ways in which people have tried to handle layoffs in a more inclusive way, whatever that means, and have still failed because they've empowered middle managers to make the decisions, but the middle managers have still come to the decision to lay off mostly Black or mostly historically marginalised workers. And so there's an interesting pattern there of sometimes even when a company perhaps makes a decision to do something which on paper sounds more inclusive, they still end up falling into that trap.
Do you think it's something to do with trying to go from 0 to 100% too quickly? It's like, let's do this thing, and it's so extreme. There's no like stepping stones to it. There's no time for people to to bring those middle managers up to speed to like, this is the pitfalls that you could fall into. Don't make these mistakes, or like, just be conscious of this thing, and this is what we're going to do to develop you to be able to make those decisions. I think we go from like one extreme to the other, and it creates this very like, binary approach to things.
Yes.
It's like, now we're doing this, and it feels very like clinical.
We're all in on this thing now.
Yeah.
And then no, the numbers changed. We're all in on that thing now.
It didn't work, so now we're not doing it. And it's like, well, no, hold on. What part of it did work?
Yes.
And what part of it did...
No,
yeah.
on to the next
like,
thing.
Shush, Kieran. Shush. No, but I didn't shh. And
Growth.
But shh. Stop saying but. Stop asking questions. Like, okay, but I can't stop asking questions.
I think there is a short-termism to tech.
Yeah.
In general. There is a grow at all cost, quickly, get as many users or get as much revenue in a short space of time as possible. Hire, fire. Hire quickly, fire quickly. You know, there's that kind of, by its very nature, it's an industry that burns through things.
Yeah, including people.
And I think what's happening now, where the rubber hits the road almost on some of the DEI commitments, is how do we reconcile the burning through stuff quickly, rocket ship, build it while you're on it, mentality with the human cost of things like mass layoffs. That's one kind of overarching question. And then there are these almost more detail-oriented questions, which are around, well, if we made a commitment in 2020 to be more inclusive and to be more diverse, and we acknowledged that George Floyd was murdered horrifically, and we suddenly realized that racism was a lived reality for people who work here, and now we want to be better and we want to make statements about being better, and we've made some modest developments in hiring more inclusively and bringing different types of people into our business. One question there is, who are they and where do they sit in your business? Because if they're new and they're junior, they're the first to go when you make a mass layoff. Often, if there is bias, which there is, there's no if there. If there's bias with your middle managers, which there is, then another thing that you could say is, okay, we're not going to do the last in, first out strategy, but we are going to look at performance. Okay, but we all know that performance systems aren't neutral either. We all know that women, if they exist at all, true, but we know that women and people from minoritized communities get rated lower for doing the same level of work. So again, now you're looking at performance, but we know that that's not existing in a neutral set of circumstances. So now we're in a position where we've burned through all of this runway we thought we had. We've hired, and we could make all of these great statements when the going was good and we were growing. And now we've got to make some cuts. And where are those cuts going to be? They're going to be with the workers who are the newest and the most junior, are sitting in the teams that are seen as overhead and not business critical. And they're going to be people who are, quote unquote, not performing.
Or have complexities around their situation in terms of professional situation, which I think is, for me, just going back to the article the article and what's going on with a lot of Indian nationals in the US is that they are on this high B visa, which then I understand needs to be renewed, or in that 6-year period that it's valid for, the expectation is that the person will seek to get citizenship. That is and I'm just speculating here, does that become a risk when you're making those decisions? if we keep that person compared to the person that's a US national, like,
we have to keep sponsoring them.
do we have to keep sponsoring them? Will they get sponsorship? Will that role then become not seen as accepted as part of that visa, whatever visa that they're on? And that's one thing, right? That's from the commercial side, which is like messed up in itself. That is like something that might, I mean, I'm speculating, that may not be a conversation that's being had. It may be an unconscious bias type thing that's happening when decisions are being made. But I think the other thing as well is, you know, are you thinking about what these people have built in that time with this specific situation? So this specific visa allows you to apply for permanent residency, so they may be in the process of doing that, but also allows them to buy property in the country. Have they invested in buying property and building a life over however many years? It might not be that they get citizenship in the first 6 years, so it could be 15 years that they've been, or however long they've been building a life. They've been adjusting to a new culture. They've built families, friends, and you're basically saying that you've lost your job, you've got 60 days essentially to find something else, or you will be deported, or you will have to leave, not deported, you will have to leave and resolve it from afar. So you have to find a job and you're not actually in the US anymore.
In the country.
That completely changes
You might have to
your
take your kid out of
circumstances.
school in the US.
Yeah. Like, does that get taken into consideration?
I would imagine not. But then there's also the flip side of... Sorry, I shouldn't say I would imagine not. I think these things do get taken into consideration in terms of severance packages in the best case scenario. If we think of the companies that are doing the most human, most thoughtful approach to layoffs, some companies do offer some help on the way out.
Yeah.
But broadly speaking, I think my experience has been, it is what it is.
Yeah.
You know, we're letting this person go. You know, I know that there was a situation when in a previous company there were layoffs at pandemic layoffs, early April 2020 layoffs. And there was a member of team who was let go and visa was about to be renewed and just had to go home, just had to go back.
Jeez.
Within, I think, about 2 or 3 weeks.
Were they able to go back?
There was a bit of a quarantine.
Okay.
There was a whole quarantine couple of months where it was like they had to spend time in a hotel here for a month and they had to spend time in a hotel there for a month. There was a whole process around it, but basically within, you know, days, it was clear that they just had to go home. So, you know, I think broadly speaking, these things aren't considered deeply.
Yeah.
And then you have the flip side in some ways of when you take the Twitter situation debacle, where Elon Musk is you know, just completely unhinged, let's be honest, and has let thousands of people go. Thousands of people have now also quit. He did his Twitter 2.0 email, reply by 5 p.m. or I'll accept your severance ultimatum.
Yeah, to work longer hours, harder, right? Like,
yes, yeah. You know, all of this stuff that he's doing, this you know, narcissistic, egomaniac behavior, and who's left behind in Twitter now? All the people on visas. So there's also the interesting flip side, which is being in a situation where you're an immigrant worker in tech.
Yeah.
If you get laid off, obviously you're in a terrible situation. But if you're in a situation like the Twitter one, sometimes you're trapped in a toxic environment.
That's so bad.
In a workplace that is treating you however it wants to treat you.
So bad.
80-hour working weeks.
Yeah.
Most of your team have gone. You're picking up work that you have never worked, you know, projects you've never worked on before, and you don't have a choice because you're on a visa.
Yeah. That's so bad. Like it's not what you expect of the modern workplace. And also, I think the thing that really like pisses me off about the whole Elon thing is like, and you see this play out as well in a lot of companies. It's a game. It's like a big game. Everything's really funny. It's like, no, it's not. It's not a big game for a lot of people. This is maybe a smaller risk for you in terms of all the companies that you have and all the future that is the prospects and the potential of other businesses. But this is having an immediate impact on people's lives, and there just seems to be no accountability for decisions that are being made. It doesn't seem like there's a much logic going into those decisions. We're applying decision-making kind of frameworks or whatever they are, whether they are frameworks or not, from a completely different type of business to tech, and just kind of almost doing it very like in a very jovial way. That's like, look at me, it's so funny. I'm playing this character in real life with real people that don't want to be a part of this show. They never subscribed to that. They never agreed to be in this situation, and it just feels really insensitive, and it feels really like disconnect. It shows a disconnection, and I think you do see that, maybe not to the same levels of extreme, not to the same levels of extreme. I've definitely seen that in corporate environments where there's just like this massive disconnect, and it's almost like there's sometimes like a jovial kind of, minimizing of the impact of the decisions that are being made, the actions that are being taken, or there's a clinic, like making it very clinical, like this is what you have to do when you're in business. This is the way you do it. It's hard, but everyone will be all right. Actually, they won't. And also, I'm not sure if this business will be all right if we continue making decisions like that.
Well, it's so many of the things you just said, that attitude is in some ways a product of being in a privileged position.
Being safe a lot of the time.
Being safe. And we know tech has a diversity problem.
Yeah.
The people who run tech companies, boards of tech companies, executives in tech companies tend to be certain demographics, certain life experience, certain amount of wealth, pre-existing wealth.
Yeah.
And so risk is...
What is it?
There's no real risk. Lose your job, get another job.
What would you do?
Take some time out.
If you had no risk. Like, what would you do? Like, what would I do if I had there was no consequences to my actions?